Horror games have made a real comeback in recent years, and it feels like this is the first time where we're seeing them truly dominate the gaming landscape across both the AAA and indie scene. Resident Evil has continually broken sales records, the Silent Hill franchise is thriving again, indie horror games are exploding on Steam, and in particular co-op horror games have had a resurgence, the like of which we haven't seen properly since the World at War and early Black Ops days. At least that's how I feel. We've also witnessed the horror indie genre taking over YouTube and Twitch again, and I don't think this is just a trend. I think it's the natural outcome and reward for bringing back franchises that old school gamers like myself love, in conjunction with the innovation coming from the indie horror game developers. To understand why horror games are dominating again, we need to understand what happened to them in the first place, and I think the release schedule of Silent Hill provides a nice timeline for when horror started to die out again. Around the release time of Silent Hill Downpour in 2012, which I know has a bad reputation, but I actually enjoyed that game. And I put this down to a number of reasons, one of them being lack of innovation within the horror genre, movement away from the fear factor roots being another one, actual horror games, and one of the culprits being every big publisher focusing on action games, or at the very least blending action games with horror games, as well as focusing on live service. Now, I'm not saying that this is still not present, but it certainly feels like the horror game genre has returned. Back in the late noughties and early 2010, horror games started losing their identity, and this is tied to the gaming industry as a whole. As the industry got exposed to bigger audiences, publishers believed that action sold better than fear or sought to capture more of these audiences, so what followed was that many horror franchises blended action with horror, with a major emphasis on the action part and not the fear factor, the horror elements. Even franchises like Resident Evil began leaning heavily into action, and eventually horror became less about atmosphere and tension and more about explosions and boulder punching. Although I still honestly love Resident Evil 5 for what it was. Not so much Resident Evil 6.
Don't suppose I think I can fly a plane, do you?
But then something changed. Players got tired of formulaic AAA games, and horror developers realized something important. Fear creates emotion in a way almost no other genre can. A huge turning point came from Capcom with the Resident Evil franchise. Instead of continuing to chase the action-orientated market quite heavily, they decided to return to their survival horror roots with the release of Resident Evil 7.
Welcome to the family, son.
Resident Evil 7 completely did a U-turn back to survival horror. It focused on immersion, atmosphere, and vulnerability again. And it worked. Honestly, I think Resident Evil 7 was the catalyst of this change and rebalancing the franchise so horror is kept at the forefront, and Capcom has basically become the blueprint for modern horror since. According to Capcom, the Resident Evil franchise has now sold over 200 million units worldwide. Resident Evil 4 Remake alone surpassed 10 million copies in around 2 years, becoming the fastest selling game in the franchise to hit that milestone. And publishers began to notice something important. Horror games were no longer small niche titles, they were becoming massive commercial successes. Now if we break it down with franchises like Resident Evil, as it became more popular amongst wider audiences, I can understand its goal to try to appease those new markets, leading to the introduction and emphasis, as I mentioned, on action more so than survival horror. Now I know there is a debate on this subject, but I do feel Resident Evil 4 Original had the balance of horror and action down perfectly. But because it was the first time action was introduced to the Resident Evil franchise, it did spark a lot of conversations. And it wasn't until Resident Evil 5 and 6 where I truly started to feel they were losing the survival horror aspect, but more importantly, the true survival horror fans. And that transition was very rough, leaning too heavily into action, if not almost completely. All of that said, there is a success story here. I do believe they finally hit the right balance of tension, fear, and action again in Resident Evil Requiem, with almost one full half being more focused on horror, creating tension and fear, and another more on the action. Additionally, if you pay close enough attention, you can actually see and feel that both fear and action are nicely spread and present throughout the entire game. And it's done in a way that fits the character that you're playing, and therefore the overall story and gameplay experience. But those are just my thoughts. Let me know what you all think in the comments, and this is a nice moment to remind you, if you do enjoy these types of videos or game dev and game analysis content, be sure to like, subscribe, and share, as I have a lot more content on the way, including my own co-op horror game that I'm currently developing. That's a little verbal teaser for you. I will have a trailer releasing hopefully sometime in the next few months, as well as some devlogs coming soon. For years, Silent Hill felt completely dead, but recently Konami has been fully investing in horror again. We're not going to talk about the movies, because this is a gaming channel. so I'm just going to pretend that never happened. And as of May 2026, Silent Hill 2 Remake has reportedly surpassed 6 million players worldwide. And playing it recently myself, I understand why. I really enjoyed the combination of atmosphere, ambience, sense of sadness while feeling hope at the same time, particularly in the game's opening cutscene and throughout the different self-dialogue moments, the survival horror gameplay of searching for every single bullet for my pistol and scavenging for health in the Woodside apartment section. The story itself, it all culminated into a really good survival horror game. And if we look at Silent Hill F, it already sold over 2 million copies. And that's incredibly important because publishers usually follow money as with any other business, and horror games are proving that they can compete at a AAA level again. Taking all of these different factors on board, and with everything said, I honestly feel the biggest reason horror has exploded again might actually be indie developers. That's because indie horror devs have tapped into something that's really valuable. Indie horror games are fun to watch. Fear is fun to watch, and is actually one of the big reasons YouTube gaming exploded back in 2012. Horror games generate reactions, and reactions dominate modern internet culture. That's why games like Repo and Lethal Company spread so insanely fast online. Even game developers on Reddit point out that horror games are incredibly entertaining for streamers and audiences. And narrowing it down even further, co-op horror became the perfect formula. Because typically when you play a horror game alone, it's quite scary. But when you play in a community, it's that sense of unity and size and numbers. I can vouch that playing alone is definitely a lot more scary than panicking together with friends. Laughing, screaming, creating clips. The key analysis here is it makes horror games incredibly shareable online. One item to also bear in mind is modern life plays a huge role in why horror is exploding. With the progression of technology, the improvement in graphics, the advent of AI, modern horror games tap into anxiety better than almost any genre. Isolation, paranoia, uncertainty, loss of control. These themes hit very hard, especially in the current state of affairs. And because indie developers are able to experiment with these concepts with psychological horror in ways AAA studios often can't, they're the ones coming out with all of the innovation and, in my opinion, paving the way for the horror genre moving forward. One industry analysis even described horror as one of the strongest reoccurring genres in recent indie game trends, and multiple horror-focused publications are now calling this period a new era for horror gaming. And honestly, I think we're only at the beginning. Modern technology is making horror more immersive than ever. Better lighting, better audio, more realistic animation, more believable AI enemies. Games are becoming harder to emotionally separate from reality. 2026 is already packed with major horror releases, from new Silent Hill projects to upcoming survival horror games across both indie and AAA studios. And the natural outcome of all of this is that the gaming horror genre is becoming the most creatively exciting spaces to work in within gaming. And that's my take why horror games feel so important again. Their return to the emotional aspect, the stress, the tension, sense of helplessness, sense of curiosity, but also hope. And when developers tap into those emotions and truly understand those feelings, you get experiences players never forget.